Oh, cool. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
It is once again that time. It's the most wonderful time of the year. That's right, not Christmas time. It's the end of daylight savings. We get an extra hour of sleep. Yes. The actual best day of the year. Mmm. And do we use it smartly by going to bed at a regular time and getting more sleep? No! We stay up later because we have that one forgiveness hour. That's what it's all about, right? But in all, I'm really excited about the end of daylight savings time. You look outside and it's pitch dark and you're like, 5:30? That's weird, but okay, I have half of the day still. But anyway, besides my excitement for the end of daylight savings, welcome to Four Lakes Church of Christ. Welcome to Sunday morning Bible class. We are continuing our study of the book of Isaiah. We are getting close to about a third of the way through with our the way that we kind of skip through chapters. Not because there's not important things in the chapters that we skip over, but mostly we're just like hitting the key points. This week, last week, we studied chapter 22, the entirety of chapter 22. This week, we are moving right to chapter 25. If you want just essentially a quick TLDR, too long didn't read, reference of like what is in those chapters in between. In chapter 22, we talked about the prophecy against Jerusalem and all that included. The next chapter is a prophecy against Tyre, which is another one of the nations that God uses as kind of an instrument of his punishment for the Israelites. But again, warning those nations that you are a tool of you are an instrument of my will, but also you still are not obeying my commands, so you will be punished just like the Israelites. And then in chapter 24, it talks about the Lord's devastation of the earth, which is very interesting because he goes into great detail what will be happening literally because of the people of Earth's sinful nature, because of their turning away from the Lord, that the planet Earth will be punished, as in it will be scorched. The earth dries up and withers, the world languishes and withers, the heavens languish with the earth. The earth is defiled by its people, they have disobeyed its laws, therefore a curse consumes the earth. And so that gives way to a lot of how people in the modern day write about apocalypse. If we think about apocalypse style literature, it's either humans bring about like a great calamity, or just the natural calamities of the earth just go crazy. And in a lot of our films, you think about Mad Max, how the earth is like this entire like just desert, how the entirety of the earth has become desolate, and like there's no longer places to grow vegetation. It's just this sun-baked, awful place where there's no kind of nature, there's no kind of natural order anymore. It's just either something that humans have brought about or something that has happened to the earth. This is kind of like a very much a large influence of like the earth being scorched, like the earth being punished because of the actions of people. So we get a lot of our apocalyptic literature from the descriptions in the Bible of the desolation of the earth. So that's just kind of an interesting little side note there. But then we get to our chapter for this morning, which is going to be chapter 25. We're going to go into chapter 26 as well, just like a few verses, just because it kind of continues the whole thought. But Isaiah 25 is where we will be this morning. And I believe the book entitles it Yahweh Salvation for Judah. And so if we start out here, we start with praise. We start with Isaiah once again, praising the Lord for, we'll just go ahead and read, and we'll see what Isaiah is praising the Lord for. So, if someone wants to read, I believe let's read verses 1 through 5. 1 through 5.
O Lord, you are my God. I will exalt you. I will praise your name, for you have done wonderful things. Your counsels of old are faithfulness and truth. For you have made a city a ruin, a fortified city a ruin, a place of foreigners to be a city no more. It will never be rebuilt. Therefore the strong people will glorify you. The city of the terrible nations will fear you. For you have been a strength to the poor, a strength to the needy in his distress, a refuge from the storm, a shade from the heat. For the blast of the terrible one is as a storm against the wall. You will reduce the noise of aliens as heat in a dry place.
All right. So, we are praising the Lord. Why are we praising the Lord? Or why is Isaiah praising the Lord?
Because the Lord's done wonderful things.
The Lord has done wonderful things. O God, you are my God, and I will ever praise you. For in perfect faithfulness you have done wonderful things, things planned long ago. What are those wonderful things? What does he say there in verse 2? You have made a city a heap of rubble. You have the fortified town has been made a ruin. The foreigner's stronghold, a city no more. It will never be rebuilt. The wonderful things is he has brought about destruction. Why is this destruction a wonderful thing? In our human minds, we think of destruction, we think of ruin, like, that's not exactly a nice thing, but why is this a wonderful thing?
If it's evil,
If it's evil, yes.
it's good to take the evil out.
Mhm. Purifying, like it says, with God, God's wrath will purify, will scorch the land, will burn away all the impurities. But I'm looking more specifically what it says in the very beginning there, specifically when he says, for in perfect faithfulness you have done wonderful things, things planned long ago. The destruction that the Lord is bringing about might be because it is happening to God's enemies, but it is because God is following through on his promise. The ruin, the destruction was foretold by those before Isaiah, even by Isaiah himself. And Isaiah is watching the Lord being faithful to his word. He preached against the Israelites. You have turned away from the Lord, there will be punishment. And Isaiah, as he watches the Assyrians come to attack Jerusalem, as he's watched the different countries make alliances and so come and lay their arms against the city of Jerusalem, Isaiah, who gets what it means to be a prophet of the Lord, he knows that this is a time of punishment, that this is a time of pain, but it is exactly what God said he would do. And Isaiah here is finding glory in the fact that God is true to his word. That the Lord is not one to shy away from punishment, is not one to use an old term, to spare the cane, spare the rod. He follows through exactly what he says he will, including all of the times that God has spoke to Isaiah saying, there will come a time where you will praise my name, where I will be angry against you no more, where I will remove your strife. And we will, as we're going to continue on, we're going to talk about the mountain of the Lord. Who will be on the mountain of the Lord, what will happen on the mountain of the Lord. But Isaiah finds peace in the foretold destruction because he knows that God is going to follow through on all the good he has promised. So just a small section of this. Let's go on verse 6 through about 12. Let's read about the mountain of the Lord. Verses 6 through 12.
The Lord of hosts will prepare a lavish banquet for all peoples on this mountain, a banquet of aged wine, choice pieces with marrow, and refined aged wine. And on this mountain he will swallow up the covering which is over all peoples, even the veil which is stretched over all nations. He will swallow up death for all time, and God will wipe away tears from all faces. And he will remove the reproach of his people from all the earth, for the Lord has spoken. And it will be said in that day, behold, this is our God for whom we have waited, that he might save us. This is the Lord for whom we have waited. Let us rejoice and be glad in his salvation. For the hand of the Lord will rest on this mountain, and Moab will be trodden down in his place, as straw is trodden down in the water of the manure pile. And he will spread out his hands in the middle of it, as the swimmer spreads out his hands to swim. But the Lord will lay low his pride together with the trickery of his hands. But inassailable fortifications of your walls he will bring forth, lay low and cast to the ground, even to the dust.
All right. So, Going back to verse 6, the beginning of the section. On this mountain the Lord Almighty will prepare a feast of rich food for all people, a banquet of aged wine, the best of meats and finest of wines. It's interesting. We see, this is an early example of, Isaiah does not say, on this mountain the Lord Almighty will prepare a feast of rich food for Israel. Here we are in the midst of the New Testament, in the midst of the Israelites' exile and coming back and being exiled again. And here we see that God is already planning the removal of just Israel being his people. Because even through the prophet, in the midst of the Israel's turning away, he's talking about, on this mountain I will prepare a feast of rich food for all people. That all those who follow his commands will be a part of this lavish feast on the mountain of the Lord, which rises above even the highest of mountains. As it continues, on this mountain he will destroy the shroud that enfolds all peoples. I think some people's interpretations even say will destroy the veil that enfolds all people. It's interesting that we use the term shroud or the term veil, because what in general I kind of think of as like a sheet. What often is the function of throwing a sheet over something?
Hide it.
To hide it? What else? To protect it? To keep whatever it might be, dust. If we're painting a wall, we put a shroud down on the floor so that the paint doesn't drip down and get all over the floor and get spread where we don't want it. It is many things, and all of those things are correct. And it's interesting here that the shroud also, I feel like, takes on so many different meanings. The obvious one that comes to mind first is that the veil that envelops all people is a separation. When there's a veil on something, you cannot touch it. You can't interact with it. You can't do anything with whatever is under the shroud. It's completely separated. You can feel it's there. You can see that there is something under that shroud, but you don't have access to it. It's cut off. So here, as we talk about the Lord's swallowing of death, as we talk about, the mountain of God, we see that he's removing the separation from the people on earth to God in the heavens,
I was gonna say, it's also foretelling the coming of Christ, because Christ tore the temple shroud or blanket, sheet, whatever, and we have a direct connection to God now.
Yeah, that was a physical example. Was when Jesus gave up his soul, what do we remember? The curtain of the temple is torn in two. There is no more separation to the Holy of Holies. In a place where only certain people were allowed to go, lest they face the wrath of God, now is completely open, is completely unseparated. Yes? Any other thoughts of the separation of the veil? Yeah.
I have a note here that said, veil with which faces are covered in mourning. In any event, the association are with death.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, when that's exactly, when someone had died, oftentimes, the women would put veils over their faces so as like it's a sign of mourning, but also in a way of you don't want your sorrow to be seen. It's something that you yourself are going through sorrows and you don't want that to be projected onto others, almost. Yeah. There's another interesting example that the book makes reference to is Moses at one point veils his face. Why does Moses veil his face? He was glowing. He had just gone up onto the mountain to receive the Ten Commandments, to speak directly with God, and as he came down from the mountain, it said his face was glowing from the presence of God. And so as to not frighten the Israelites, so as to he might not have known, but in a way like maybe save them from any kind of punishment, from seeing even a fragment of God's glory remaining on him, he puts a veil over his face. As a separation from God's power affecting those around him. So I thought that was a fun reference that I made there. And then another example of a shroud or a veil being referenced is if we want to Real quick, flip over, let's go to 2 Corinthians. If you want to go to 2 Corinthians chapter 3. 2 Corinthians chapter 3, around verse, turned around verse 14. This is in the midst of Paul making an argument for how some of the Christians are caught up in the old law versus the new law. How there's arguments for both, but he talks about how now if the ministry that brought death, the old law, which was engraved in letters on stone, came with glory, so that the Israelites could not look steadily at the face of Moses because of its glory, there we see it again, transitory though it was, will not the ministry of the Spirit be even more glorious? If the ministry that brought down condemnation was glorious, how much more glorious is the ministry that brings righteousness? For what was glorious has no glory now in comparison with its surpassing glory. And then if we move into, verse 12, 13, 14. Therefore, since we have such a hope, we are very bold. We are not like Moses, who would put a veil over his face to prevent the Israelites from seeing the end, what is passing away. But their minds were made dull, for to this day the same veil remains when the old covenant is read. It has not been removed, because only in Christ is it taken away. Even to this day, when Moses is read, a veil covers their hearts. But whenever anyone turns to the Lord, the veil is taken away. So there we see that when we get too caught up in one teaching, that this one part of the Bible is the important part. That's the part we have to focus on. It says there's a veil on their hearts. There isn't a physical separation from person to person that covers them. It is their hearts are unable to receive the good news. That when they read Moses and the old law, they cannot receive the good news, which is the ministry of Jesus. Will not the ministry of the Spirit be even more glorious? If the ministry that brought condemnation was glorious, how much more glorious is the ministry that brings righteousness? So here we see that when we talk about veils, we can't let it be a separation from what is equally, if not more, as important. We can't let ourselves be covered and think that, okay, this teaching, this that I've learned is the only thing that I have to learn. There's no need to reach out to pull back the veil that's covering me to see what is beyond, because that might be scary. That might be something different. Different. Change is scary. But how is the veil removed? It has not been removed, because only in Christ is it taken away. But whenever anyone turns to the Lord, the veil is taken away. Here we see, as those who sit on the mountain of the Lord, those who have followed his ways, those who have obeyed his commands, who sit on the mountain, have the veil removed. And as we turn back to Isaiah, sorry, sometimes phones do not work when you want them to. So, on this mountain he will destroy the shroud that enfolds all peoples. Not only is he opening up the way to heaven, the way to see God in all his glory, but in the same way as they turn to the Lord, he takes the shroud off their hearts, off their minds. They are able to receive exactly what God has promised, because they followed in his ways and thus had the veil over themselves removed. The sheet that covers all nations, he will swallow up death forever. As a result of that, the sovereign Lord will wipe away the tears from all faces. No tears in heaven, no sorrows given. All will be glory in that day. He will remove his people's disgrace from all the earth. The Lord has spoken. We are completely past now the time of the Israelites being punished for their iniquities. Now we move into the time that Jesus ultimately brings about. through his sacrifice that all people are now God's chosen people. And as they obey his commands, they are taken up onto the mountain of the Lord, and the ultimate veil is drawn back. In that day, they will say, "Surely this is our God. We trusted in him, and he saved us. This is the Lord. We trusted in him. Let us rejoice and be glad in his salvation." The words straight from the people's mouths. They trusted in the Lord, as the Israelites are not doing now. And we are shown that they are given glory, that they are given joy, because they can be glad in his salvation. It says, "The hand of the Lord will rest on the mountain." I often think of whenever Elijah the prophet is in the wilderness and the Lord comes to speak to him, and he covers the alcove that Elijah sits in so that he can get a glimpse of God as he passes by, not even a full view, but just, that's still a comfort. That when we talk about when someone's going through something tough, or when oftentimes when a family member or when they themselves are in the hospital, what do we often wish for someone? That God's hand of comfort be upon them. That just as the Lord will rest his hand on the mountain, so too we hope that the Lord rests his hand on those who need it, who need uplifting. But Moab, specific instance of another country used as the Lord's punishment, will be trampled in their land, as straws trampled down in the manure. They will stretch out their hands in it as swimmers stretch out their hands to swim. They will be buried in so much manure that they'll have to swim through it. They won't be able to stand in it. God will bring down their pride despite their cleverness, despite the cleverness of their hands. Again, we see an example. He warned Assyria about this, and so too does he say this about Moab. Despite them being a part of God's plan, they don't turn to God as their source of power. They put value in the cleverness of their hands. It says God will bring down their pride despite the cleverness of their hands. Oftentimes, do you ever feel like you found a cheeky way, a clever way to find a loophole to cut corners on some kind of project to get something done? You're like, cool, this was a much faster way to do it. And then it all comes crashing down and you realize, oh, there's a reason we take the long way, because that's how it's supposed to be done. Because sometimes this one missing screw, one bolt that isn't exactly where it should be, can send the entire thing crumbling down. And so here it talks about Moab, despite the cleverness of their hands, despite them thinking, we have figured out a way to overcome the Israelites. We have found some way ourselves to be the most powerful people. And that God says, nope, you didn't do it the right way. And so it all is going to come crumbling down. And a big old pool of manure. And the last thing there, he will bring down your high fortified walls and lay them low. He will bring them down to the ground, to the very dust. In our last study in chapter 22, it talked about how the Israelites were tearing down their own homes to try and fortify their walls. They were taking weapons from the palace of pines to try and fortify something that was already foretold to be set for destruction. And here we see all your high fortified walls, they will be laid low. He's going to bring them down to the ground, to the very dust. And again, we've had many different ways throughout our studies of flavor text to say, you have your human constructs that you think are mighty and high, you have mansions, you have walls, you have palaces filled with weapons. All these things are completely just going to be laid barren. Because again, they're not of God. You've built upon what the Lord has provided for you and thought that these structures are the grandest things you've ever seen. And the Lord says, all of it's going to be gone. Any other thoughts on chapter 25 before we move on? All right, so chapter 26. Moving on, I'm going to go through the first 9 chapters. Make sure I didn't skip any. Because sometimes I get ahead of my notes, so I got to make sure I don't skip anything. All right, cool. All right, so moving on to chapter 26, we continue a song of praise. If someone, I don't think it's what it said, no. Let's just go ahead and read. Let's read verses 1 and let's go through, let's read verses 1 through 6. 1 through 6.
In that day, this song will be sung in the land of Judah. We have a strong city. God makes salvation its walls and ramparts. Open the gates that the righteous nation may enter. The nation that keeps faith, you will keep in perfect peace. Those whose minds are steadfast because they trust in you. Trust in the Lord forever, for the Lord himself is the rock eternal. He humbles those who dwell on high. He lays the lofty city low. He levels it to the ground and casts it down to dust. Feet trample it down, the feet of oppressed, the footsteps of the poor.
Thank you. So, we have a strong city. God makes salvation its walls and ramparts. Immediately after talking about how the Israelites, the men's walls will be brought low to the ground, will be made like dust. He says, in that day, the land of Judah will sing, we have a strong city. And what are the walls and ramparts made of? Salvation. God makes salvation its walls and ramparts. It will have no need for walls and ramparts because there will be no one to attack it. There won't be anyone who will make moves against it. They will open the gates that the righteous nation may enter. And who are the people of the righteous nation? Is it the Israelites? Is it the people of, I don't know, spouting out random cities, Gethsemane? Is it this country? Is it that country? It's not any one country or people, is it?
The one that remains faithful.
Christians.
Right.
The righteous nation is the nation that keeps faith. You will keep in perfect peace those whose minds are steadfast, because they trust in you. Trust in the Lord forever, for the Lord himself, is the rock eternal. The rock is a symbol that is used many times throughout the Bible. What are some examples of people being compared to rocks?
Peter.
Peter? Yeah, the most obvious one that I think of, is on this rock I will build my church.
Jesus.
Jesus. Jesus is the cornerstone, even, to get more specific. The stone, the rock that supports everything else. The entirety of the Lord's house is built upon the rock, the cornerstone that is Jesus. And none come to mind right now, but are there any other examples of people being described as rocks that come to your mind?
People being like soil or sand in the parable, and the seeds are planted, right?
Yeah, like the stony path, the rocky path.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it can have negative connotation. The parable of the sower of the seeds. And seeds are cast down to the good soil and they grow and there's things produced. Yeah, and then there's the stony path, the path where there's no room to settle. There's no soil to be found to dig into. Yeah, so in that way, sometimes a rocky or a stony path means, and oftentimes when you think of rocky soil, there is soil there, but the rocks are so dug into it, are just obstructions that there's no room to plant any seed. There's no room for any kind of good to kind of take root there, so that's why it's not good for growing. Yeah, okay, another example. All right, so continuing on. Here, the Lord himself is the rock eternal. Rocks can erode, rocks can be washed away. The Grand Canyon is a good example. The Grand Canyon is a rock that water has just slowly dug this massive chasm into. And yet the Lord himself is the rock eternal. Nothing will wear it away. Nothing will move it. The Lord himself is the rock eternal upon which this entire thing's built. And then we once again look to those who are prideful, those who think themselves higher than this grand city. He humbles those who dwell on high, and he lays the lofty city low. He levels it to the ground and casts it down to the dust. Feet trample it down, the feet of the oppressed, and the footsteps of the poor. In future examples of the New Testament, we often see that people quote verses like this. I guess the example that I think of is whenever Mary goes to visit Elizabeth, when they're both with child. How Mary is pregnant with Jesus and Elizabeth is pregnant with John the Baptist. And she quotes this to her. It says, he humbles those who dwell on high. He lays the lofty city low. He levels it down to the ground, and feet trample it down, the feet of the oppressed, the footsteps of the poor. In a time where the Israelites were very much, again, back to their land, but are not being treated well. King Herod is imposing taxes, as whenever Jesus is born, goes through and tries to kill off all the baby boys. And here, Mary, in a time where the Israelite people were once again kind of downtrodden, is quoting hope that the Lord is just, that those who are on high, those who oppress the poor, will be brought low, and that those who are downtrodden are the ones who will do the trampling. That feet trample it down, the feet of the oppressed and the footsteps of the poor. I'm going to come back to this, but first off, let's finish off our little section here. Let's read verses 7, 8, 9.
The way of the just is uprightness, O most upright. You weigh the path of the just. Yes, in the way of your judgments, O Lord, we have waited for you. The desire of our soul is for your name and for the remembrance of you. With my soul I have desired you in the night. Yes, by my spirit within me, I will seek you early. For when your judgments are in the earth, the inhabitants of the world will learn righteousness.
All right. The path of the righteous is level. You, the upright one, make the way of the righteous smooth. Yes, Lord, walking in the way of your laws, we wait for you. As we continue on, we have multiple descriptions of my mind goes to the wide and the narrow gate. How wide is the gate that leads to hell and to destruction, and narrow is the gate that leads to salvation. But here it says that when you wait upon the upright one, that he makes the way of the righteous smooth. That it may be a narrow gate, it may be a long path to salvation, but if we follow it in the way that the Lord commands, the path of the righteous is level. The way of the righteous smooth. Yes, Lord, walking in the ways of your laws, we wait for you. Your name and renown are the desire of our hearts. Oftentimes, it's easy to walk down the road to the wide gate because there's not really any focus. It just kind of seems like wandering sometimes. You can, oftentimes, I'm very vocal about my dislike of running, of any kind of recreational running. I grew up, when I played sports, I did the power stuff. I was a lineman, in wrestling, and all these things. I didn't have to go very far. And so oftentimes I'm very vocal about my distaste for, look at that thing over there. I'm just happy looking at it. I don't have to go over there, I don't have to move. But the way that I make it through whenever I do run is I try and shut my brain down. I try and run mindlessly. I don't want to think about anything. I don't want to think about how my feet hurt and my lungs are burning. And this is dumb. Why am I doing this? But I found that And again, this is a kind of a stretch. But the way that I make running easier is I listen to music. Is I find something else to focus on. Something, words, music that pushes me forward. That gives me this feeling of I'm moving forward because there's this force, there's this something that is spurring me onwards. And here we see that the path of the righteous, that they walk with the desire of the Lord in their hearts. My soul yearns for you in the night, and in the morning my spirit longs for you. That those who walk the path to destruction are on, words are hard. The path to destruction, to the wide gate, can oftentimes just be a mindless wandering towards destruction. That oftentimes a blank mind leads to nothing good. But here we see that the path, the upright path, the path that is level and that is smooth for the righteous, they're driven on by the desire of their hearts. They wait for the Lord. As they walk in the ways of their laws, we wait for you. Your name and renown are the desire of our hearts. My soul yearns for you in the night, in the morning, my spirit longs for you. All day and all night, their minds, the righteous minds, are set on seeking the Lord. They find this something that gives them the will, that gives them the drive to keep on going. Even though the destination might be very far away, it might be a very small target, it might seem like something difficult to get to. But walking in the way of the Lord, their soul yearns for it. Their hearts want to make it to that place. And so too, if we keep the Lord in our hearts, if we keep the Lord on our mind, that long path might not seem so far, might not seem as bad, because by walking in the way of the Lord, the path becomes smoother. It becomes more level. That doesn't mean it's going to be shorter. That doesn't mean there's going to be less to run through. But because of the love of God, because of our desire to be with God, to be like Him, it makes the way that much easier in our minds. It makes it less stressful on our hearts. When your judgments come upon the earth, the people of the world learn righteousness. Those who walk in His way know about His righteousness, but when the Lord does finally come again and when His judgment comes upon the earth, everyone will learn about righteousness. So thank you for indulging me in my running analogy. But I hope that you got the point I was trying to make, that keeping the Lord in your mind and in your heart makes the path easier. Doesn't make it shorter, doesn't make it less full of obstacles, but it helps us move along. It helps us move down that path towards righteousness, towards salvation. And that's kind of the end of our biblical reading this morning. Any other thoughts on that little section of chapter 26? All right, well, in closing, we're kind of down to our last 5 minutes, so I'll get us out before the time it appears. But at the end of the day, yeah, the way of the righteous oftentimes is no different than the way to destruction, but the word of the Lord, the way of the Lord, keeps us on the right path and helps that path seem a little bit more manageable. And here I'm just repeating myself, so I think that's a good place to stop. So any other last thoughts overall about what we've talked about, something that I might have missed, any points that you would like to make before we close up? All right, well, we are dismissed. Thank you for a good class.